From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Is Russia's invasion of Ukraine slowly turning in Ukraine's favor? There are some signs that may be happening. Plus, Western Europe is paying the price, and it is a big one for its climate change policies and reliance on Russian gas as winter approaches. Could the U.S. be far behind? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, here with another edition of Potomac Watch, and my colleagues Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. Joe's operating out of London as usual. First, let's put in a word about Queen Elizabeth II. Joe, what's the mood in London on this?
There has been this awareness that she is 96 years old and did seem to be appearing a bit frailer in her public appearances over the past year, and especially over the past few months. And so I think that people have known that we were coming into a period where her health might start failing in a more serious way, but it's still a real shock that it's happening. And certainly she's a very important figure in the life of the nation. People feel a lot of affection for her as the monarch. She's very much bound up in people's sense of Britishness, British identity, what the country is. So I think that this is a very anxious moment for people.
And that affection is manifesting itself, not just in the UK, but also around the world. All right, let's talk about the war in Ukraine. As Kyiv is staging an offensive in southern and eastern Ukraine, that seems to be having some effect. The goal, obviously, to take back territory that the Russians grabbed earlier this year with its artillery barrages in the Donbass region and the south, before the Ukrainians were able to get enough artillery weapons and missiles to fight back. The goal is also to break up logistics nodes and supply lines for the Russians to be able to resupply their forces in southern Ukraine, maybe having some effect, Kim, as they're taking back some territory.
Yeah, we've really seen this strategy by the Ukrainians finally maybe beginning to pay out a little bit of benefit for them. They obviously had suffered devastating artillery and airstrikes from the Russians. But one thing that's happened is the Russians look to have run through some of their stockpiles here. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians, rather than engaging in some sort of massive attack to take back a big chunk of territory, are engaging in these smaller offenses. And it's paying off some benefits. That they've advanced about 30 miles in the east. A Ukrainian general said that they had liberated about 20 villages. They're trying to cut supply routes there, in particular a critical road hub near the town of Kupiak, which the Russians use for resupplying and the movement of their forces. So if they can cut that off, it would be quite significant strategically. And similarly, in the south, they're seeking to cut off thousands of Russian troops that are on the western bank at the Dnipro River. Again, with these kind of very targeted attacks, one thing that I think has helped a lot has been American equipment like HIMARS, which allowed the Ukrainians to focus and hit installations that are behind Russian lines. So some of this support that's been coming in from the West and the strategy the Ukrainians have been deploying seems to be shifting, at least modestly, the thrust of the war at the moment.
A couple of fascinating events this week on Ukraine, Joe. One is the report based on U.S. intelligence officials leaking to media that Russia's basically had to go to, of all places, North Korea for armament resupplies, artillery shells and missiles. And that follows the report a couple of weeks ago that Russia is banking on drones coming from Iran. Iran makes a lot of drones, military drones, because clearly Russia needs the ammunition. Its stocks are going down, as Kim said. And the fascinating thing here is usually these great powers, or at least a country like Russia that strives to be seen and to be a great power, is now relying on its client states for the ammunition. That's not the way it usually works. Also, Vladimir Putin this week threatening to stop all natural gas supplies to Europe and throwing in oil as well, further exacerbating Europe's energy shortfall, and also threatening to stop grain exports from Ukraine that he's been allowing under a deal negotiated with Ukraine and the UN to allow grain exports through the Black Sea. I think this is a sign of Putin's frustration, Joe.
I think that's absolutely correct. The thing that ties those two stories together, the Russian arms purchases from its clients and then also the new energy and food threats directed at Europe is the fact that we're now past the 6-month mark of the war. No one expected that we would be here this long, particularly not Vladimir Putin himself. And one senses that there is this real desire to try to figure out what are the things that he needs to do. First off, to be able to sustain a war effort in terms of ammunition, weapons, other military tools, having burned through what he came into the war with himself. And then also, what does he need to do to try to exert pressure on Ukraine's partners to try to then come back to Kyiv and exercise some pressure on the Ukrainians to end it from their side. And I think that, you can't escape the suspicion that a lot of what's going on with the energy or the grain exports right now is this Russian attempt to put pressure on the Western Europeans in particular to start leaning on Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to negotiate some kind of ceasefire just to make the pain stop before we get into Europe's winter. But at this point, the 6-month mark, I have to believe that from Putin's perspective, it is all about trying to end this as quickly as possible at this point.
Which is, I think, not where he wanted to be, Joe, as you suggest. And the conventional wisdom has been, and I certainly had been a subscriber to it, that Zelensky would be under the most pressure because he's losing territory. The economic damage has been extreme. And then the Europeans suffering the economic fallout from the war and our reliance on Russian energy. Now, President Zelensky said this week that you cannot rule out nuclear escalation by Russia. Kim, certainly Putin has saber-rattled that before, the prospect that he might have to do that. But, of course, the cost to him would be enormous if he did resort to that. But I think we can't rule out some kind of escalation by Putin here if the war begins to take a more dramatic turn against his Russian forces. I know he's been reluctant to he's called up more Russian troops for his forces, but he has been reluctant to have a nationwide draft and forcible enlistment. But there's no question, I think, that the pressure on Putin is growing.
I think it may come down to just how desperate he feels in the end. It's been interesting to watch that there are indeed certain limits that Russia seems to have hit up against or might be mindful of. A good example of that, you were talking about these grain exports and the fact that Putin is suggesting he might have to crack down on those and stop those. But the reality is that the reason Russia agreed back in July to a deal that was spearheaded by the United Nations and Turkey to allow those Ukrainian grain exports is because the country was concerned, its leadership was concerned that it would get blamed for a global famine if it didn't go along with that. So it certainly is still cognizant of international condemnation and pushback for it to take certain steps. But I think all bets are off if Russia looked as though it might face some sort of humiliating loss in the Ukraine. One of the things that's even on the table at the moment is this movement that Ukraine is making down in the Kherson region in the south. There's a possibility there's some 20,000 Russian troops sitting there. And if Ukraine played its cards the right way, they could trap some of those forces and force them to surrender or flee. What does Putin do in the face of that? And he still does, unfortunately, have a lot of very bad things he could do, including the nuclear saber rattling, as you were mentioning, causing something and then also trying to blame it on Ukraine. This is the way Russia operates. But I wouldn't in any way bet yet that he is at the end of his bag of tricks.
There is also been talk, at least in some circles, think tank circles and so on, that if Putin did block the grain exports, continuing to block Ukraine's grain exports coming out of Odessa, the one port, the major port that Ukraine still controls on the Black Sea, that the coalition of the willing obviously would have to be led by the U.S., but wouldn't have to be a NATO operation, could be just a group of nations, could formulate a naval escort operation, Joe, to get some of these grain ships and see them out of the Black Sea. Putin obviously could engage those ships if he wanted to, but he knows, I think, that he does not have the capacity to take on the United States Navy.
Right. I think the big challenge in that scenario would be getting the Allied ships to participate in that in the first place, because I think that one of the things that has been going on has been a great deal of trepidation, especially on the part of Western European allies, to do anything that might, they think, cause some kind of escalation on Putin's part, which goes back to this whole conversation about the threat that Putin would use some kind of tactical nuclear weapon as part of this. That has been an enormous fear on the part of the Western Europeans. So I think that it's actually kind of good in a way to be having some of these conversations again at this point about thinking long and hard about what could Putin actually do? What would be the consequences of that, kind of as a way of increasing the comfort level with European partners of potentially provoking that kind of response, persuading the Europeans that actually that cost of action on something like breaking a naval blockade of Ukraine, the cost of action would be lower than the cost of inaction if they allow this blockade to continue.